Hello everyone, and welcome to this 2D meshing tutorial using Hypermesh. In this tutorial we will be covering in detail the different functions and the different options that we have when it comes to 2D meshing. If you find this video useful, please feel free to drop a like and subscribe for more content like this.
For the most part, if you wanted to generate that 2D mesh, you just use the auto mesh button that I had right here. So again, to do it on the panel section, you go to 2D and then you select auto mesh. That'll bring you into the auto mesh panel. So with this auto mesh panel, we're able to just automatically generate a mesh that on the geometry without much effort, right? So we have a ton of different options here and a ton of different buttons. The main ones that you guys have to worry about is just mostly the element size, the mesh type, and then we have some parameters here that let you create a nicer mesh as you generate the mesh on your geometry. So ideally, normally what you end up having to do is we select an element size. In this case, I'll just start off with 10, and then we can select an element type. And like I mentioned, the main elements that we use are quads, so quadratic elements, so just squares, or triads, which are just triangular elements. And we can also have mixed elements, so a combination between squares and triangles. Our triads, which makes it right triangles, so it's all generated with right triangles, and then we have quads only. So ideally what we end up doing, most of the time you end up using just a mixed element type, and we end up just generating a mesh on this. So once you specify a element size and a mesh type, all you have to do is just select the surfaces that you're going to be meshing. So in this case, when I refer to a surface, it can be anything here between these lines, these green lines. So anything here is what we call a surface. So for example, if I click on a surface here, you'll see that I can select those particular surfaces. Now, if I don't want to go about selecting every single surface individually, what you can do is you can click on the yellow box itself, and that'll bring all of these selection options, right? So you can actually use different methods. Like we can select all of the displayed surfaces right here. So if I click on displayed, then it'll go ahead and select all of the displayed surfaces, and I don't have to click each one individually. So now that I've selected all of the surfaces, and I've selected an element type, or an element size, and also an element type, then we can go ahead and, for this case, I'm just going to turn off all of these so I can show you what this does. And I'll also expand this tree here so you can also see what's going on. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and mesh this, right? So you select the surfaces, select the size, and click mesh. That's really all you have to do. Now notice how this goes ahead and generates a mesh for me. Now when we're talking about meshing, you'll see that the geometry goes about, this is kind of like a very rough representation of the geometry that we have here. And you'll have, for example, elements that are a little bit skewed off, or the elements end up being, warped quite a bit because of the geometry itself. So for example, here we have all sorts of crazy stuff going on, and we have these elements that are very skewed off here. For example, this one here. But right at this point, we haven't finalized the mesh per se. As you can see at the bottom here, the panel changed, but the mesh isn't. It's allowing us to make some adjustments to the mesh before we finalize it. So what we can do is we can actually go about all of these edges. So each one of those green lines kind of specifies an edge, right? So those edges, you can specify the number of nodes that you want on that edge. So I can click on any of these numbers and increase the number of elements that I have along that edge, right? So if I increase the number and I click on mesh on the right here, you'll see that the number of elements changes, and I can increase it on both sides here. And that'll go ahead and generate a nicer mesh. And you can go about manually increasing the number of elements that you want throughout the whole thing here, but it can be very time consuming, and depending on what you're trying to achieve, sometimes it's not even worth doing all of that. So as you can see here, we have triangular elements and we have square elements. And the big thing between those two types of elements is that you can capture the geometry a lot better using triangular elements. So when you're doing sharp corners like this, where the geometry can be fairly complicated, it's a lot easier to use these triangular elements. But the problem with triangular elements is that they are inherently stiffer elements. So due to the actual shape and the math behind it, triangular elements tend to give you a larger error when it comes to meshing your geometry. So normally, a lot of people try to minimize the number of triangular elements that they have. There are some things you can do to be able to get better results using triangular elements. But for the most part, you don't want to use triangular elements very often. There are some cases where you would have to, like if the geometry is very complicated, you'll have to use all triangular elements. But in some cases, you'll have mostly quad elements. And what you'll find is, depending on the industry and the area that you're working with, some people, like for example aerospace companies, tend to only want quad elements. So if you were to go about this and trying to generate only quads for this mesh, you'd have to, for example, increase the number of elements here just till you get a number of square elements here, right? But then you'd have to go about your entire model just kind of modifying it and changing the edges to be able to acquire a completely quad mesh. So for example, here I can increase this value, and I can increase the value here, and I can start just kind of cleaning it up and getting a better mesh out of this, right? Getting rid of all those triangular elements. But the thing is that it can be very time consuming, and I'll show you guys a very good example once we start getting into 3D meshing. But for now, just kind of focus on doing these auto mesh meshes. So these auto mesh meshes are, you don't have as much control over it as you would want, but you can change. I mean, you can go about, just increasing the number of elements, decreasing the number of elements. And with Hypermesh, you can even go as far as moving individual elements around to get the exact mesh that you're trying to do. So there's a lot of power with this. But the thing is, the main thing that you want to watch out for when you're generating a 2D mesh is these kinds of cases here, where, for example, you have these very warped elements, like this triangular element that you have here. Hopefully you guys can see that, where it's extremely warped. So any results that you get from that type of element are going to be horrible results. You're going to get an incredible amount of stress focused in that region, and it's just going to give you bad results. So ideally, what you want to do is you would want to clean up this geometry, right? So now, once you're done with this mesh, I can go ahead and just click return. And what you'll see is that the mesh is overlapped by the geometry. The geometry was being shown in gray earlier, and the mesh itself right now is shown in pink, it looks like. So as you can see, in certain areas, like in these curved areas, the geometry sticks out a little bit further from the mesh itself. And that's because if I turn off the geometry real quick, you can see how the mesh is created around these curved areas, right? So then the mesh itself is not good enough to be able to mesh around these corners. So what we'd ideally want to do at this point is we'd want to increase the number of elements going through these edges here. So a couple of ways that we can do that is if we go ahead and do the auto mesh again, where I go ahead and select all of the surface. So I'm still in the auto mesh panel at this point. I can just go ahead and click surfaces, click displayed on the left here, and then just click mesh again. And what this will do is it'll just update the current mesh that's on there. And this is something that you can do when you're working with 2D meshes. You can just update the current mesh you're working with. So to give you guys an example is how I can capture the geometry around there a little bit better, I can increase the number of nodes on the curve here, on this fillet. And I can go ahead and click mesh. Probably if I do it even, be better. So if I do, like, for example, 7 elements running through that, you can see how the curvature changes a little bit better, right? So that's capturing the geometry a lot better at this point. And you can see that it doesn't stick out as much now. So what ended up happening here is that now I've increased the number of elements, which means that even though I've captured the geometry a little bit better, the calculation time is going to take a lot longer. So when I send this over to the solver is going to take a lot longer to compute due to the increased number of elements, because now it has to do a calculation for each one of these elements that I just created. So that's the idea behind meshing, right? And we can go about trying to manipulate the mesh around everything here. But we do have some options here that let us do what's called size and a skew. And what these size and skew options do is it lets you go ahead and set limitations to how big the elements can be and how skewed the elements can be, right? So we had some very badly skewed elements in this corner here, right, due to these lines that we have here. So since Hypermesh tries to fit elements within these edges, it tries to fit an element in this very sharp point here. So ideally what we'd want to do is we'd want to suppress or get rid of this edge here so it doesn't consider it, and it can just generate an element there. So then in order to do that, what I can do is I can click return and just get out of this auto mesh panel. So I'll go ahead and click return. And we'll go back to the geometry button up here, right? Now, yesterday I showed you guys how, last time I showed you guys how we had all of the most useful tools located in this one button here, right? So if we go to quick edit, we have all of the most useful tools here. And for example, we can do this toggle edge option. Now, when you toggle an edge, yesterday I showed you how you can repair those free edges that you have on your geometry, but you can actually toggle an edge and suppress the lines if you needed to. So for example, if I click on this line here, this green line right here, and I click on it once, you'll see that that line, or it's very faint, but you'll see that this line is like a dotted blue line. And what that means is that it suppressed that line and it's completely ignoring it now, which means that that element that was being forced in within those two lines can now spread out nicely, and you can see how the element improved here. So if I undo that again, you can see how it fits an element in here and they're very skewed off. But if I suppress it, I redo, you see how these elements stretch out and now you get much higher quality elements. Ideally, what I mean by high quality elements is you want a perfect square. That's the best element that you can have, or a perfect triangle. But in some cases, the elements have to get skewed off in order to fit, right? So the more you skew off these elements, the worse results you're going to be getting. So ideally, you want to make sure that your elements stay as close to a perfect square as possible. So that's what's happening here. So again, if I show you what it looked like before, it's completely, this is much more like a rectangle than a square, and that's also not ideal. So we can go ahead and redo what I did. And even though this is tapered off a little bit, it's not as squeezed in there, so you have better results. Now we can use this toggle, the suppress tool, and suppress most of these lines to kind of clean it all up, right? So I could do, like, for example, that one there, and I can go about the entire model, right? But once I start getting to these areas here, it starts becoming a bit of a hassle to suppress all of these lines and trying to correct everything and trying to fix everything that we have, right? So in order to fix all of this a little bit quicker, since we are engineers and we don't want to put so much effort into things that we don't have to, we can just go ahead and use, for example, the auto cleanup panel. So if I click return and I go to geometry, we have this auto cleanup option. And I got some questions regarding this last time as far as cleaning up geometry using this, but that's not really the intended way of doing it, right? So the auto cleanup tool, ideally what it's going to do, you're going to be able to set a certain criteria. So for example, here I can edit criteria, and I can just specify, like, for example, what size elements I'm going to be looking for, and just tell it what ideally I want to have, right? So what it'll do is, so in this case, my target element size is size 10, and you can go as far as, you know, setting an aspect ratio, setting how much you want it to warp, limiting how much it's going to skew, and you can spend some time doing this kind of stuff. But for now, we can just do target element size. And if we click OK, all we have to do now is, as you can see over here, we need to select surfaces. So again, I can just click on the yellow button and just select the displayed surfaces. And what we can do now is just go ahead and run auto cleanup. And what this will do is it'll go around the model, it'll find these edges that are so close together that it doesn't allow for the elements to fit the criteria, and it'll automatically suppress them for you. So as you can see here, it went ahead and suppressed a bunch of these lines here. It suppressed everything here. And then on this as well, it suppressed these lines also. And over here, it suppressed all these lines. So it went around the model. It tried to clean up the geometry as much as it could in order to try to make sure that everything stays within the criteria that I set. So now if we look at our mesh in these regions that were problematic, you can see that, well, right here we have a pretty bad element, and I can kind of see why here. So what I can do is we can also make changes to it. Like for example, in this case, what ended up happening, you can see we have a very sharp triangular element there, and that's because it's trying to fit between this point here and this point here, and it just can't fit an element there. So if I go ahead and suppress this line and unsuppress this line instead, then it should clean it up a little bit better. So if I go back to that quick edit panel, and then in order to unsuppress a line, I can just right click on that line and then left click on the one I want to suppress. Then if I hide my geometry, you can see that it cleans it up a little bit better. So the auto mesh tool is not perfect. You still want to review your model a little bit, but it does make everything a lot easier. So those are some of the advantages and disadvantages of having the auto cleanup tool, right? So now, one other thing that I want to kind of cover here would be the actual manipulation of the mesh, or trying to set some limitations so that you can mesh the part accurately, right? So one model that I'm going to show you guys an example of here is I'm going to go ahead and open, and instead of working on one of these here, well, let's do this next one here. So this would be chapter 3B. Okay, so go to chapter 3 and open model B. And that should bring in the geometry that we worked on yesterday, where we defeatured it and we cleaned it up and we made a 2D geometry out of it, right? So now that we have this 2D geometry, we can go ahead and mesh this, right? So again, in order to mesh this, all we have to do is select the auto cleanup panel. So we can go to 2D, auto mesh, sorry, I meant to say auto mesh, and then we can go ahead and select the displayed surfaces again, and you'll be doing that very often. And again, like I mentioned yesterday, there's two options. You can select the displayed, you can select all, and the difference between the two is that if you select all, it'll select surfaces that you might have hidden, right? So if you have another geometry on top of that and you have it hidden away, it will select the surfaces of that hidden geometry as well. So most of the time you want to select displayed instead of all. So here we have this geometry, and I want to ideally do a quad mesh of the whole thing, right? So we're going to try to get rid of all of the quad elements here. So if I click on quads, right, we have this option between quads and quads only. And the difference between quads and quads only is that quads will still try to put in a triangular element here and there, to like wherever it finds it very necessary, but the quads only mesh will go ahead and just set the whole thing to only quads, right? So, and regardless of how much they warp off. But the thing is that at one point you still end up generating some triangular elements. If the software just can't fit the elements nicely, then most of the time it's better to use quads instead of quads only. So what we're going to do is we're going to set to quads only. And now notice this next option here that says elements to surface comp, right? And what this is telling you is that it's going to generate the elements on the component of the surface, so wherever your surface is. But let's say you want to keep your mesh on a different component. Like I mentioned yesterday, the components are more like a folder, not necessarily a part. So if you want to create a new component, for example, so if we right click create component, we can have a new component here, and we can store our mesh on this component. I'll go ahead and change the color of that to like purple or something. So we have the option of either meshing it to the component where the surface is located. In this case, it's this yellow one. Or we can go ahead and change it to this main component that we created. Now, I just noticed I'm in by topology. Okay, yeah, should be fine. So for the most part, what we can do is we can change this parameter to the current component. Now, this gives me the chance to explain what a current component is. So as you can see, I have a list of 3 components here, and one of them is in bold. So the one in bold is what's called the current component. So if I right click on any of these, I can just make current any of these components. So if I want to do something in a very specific component and not necessarily in the one that I'm currently working on, then you can just set that component to the current component. In this case, it's already the current component. And then what you can do is you can change this parameter. So instead of elements to the current component or elements to the surface component, you can change the parameter to create the elements on the current component. So it'll, instead of generating it on this yellow one, it'll generate it on this purple one. So now what I can go ahead and do is select the surfaces again. And then I just go ahead and click mesh. And that'll go ahead and generate a mesh. Now in this case, my element size was way too big. So I need to remesh the whole thing and make it smaller, right? So if I, as you can see here in the middle, I have this option that lets me select an element size again. So if I want to remesh the whole thing again, I can just do, like, for example, an element size of 5, and I can click recalculate all. And then when I click mesh, it'll make the elements a little bit smaller. In this case, it's still not small enough, so I'll probably do like size 1. Recalculate, and then I'll go ahead and mesh the whole thing. But now that's a little too fine, so I'm going to go ahead and do 2, recalculate all, and mesh. And this is a very common thing that you'll find yourself doing. I do get people asking me, like, how do I know what an ideal mesh size is when I start doing this kind of stuff? And what you'll find is that it comes with experience most of the time, but it's mostly trial and error. Most of the time you're just going to, like, change the size a bunch of times. But when you're doing a 3D mesh, that process is a little more complicated. But I'll talk about that once we get to that section. Now here, I've gone ahead and generated a 2D mesh. And another method that I like to use when I'm using Hypermesh is that using the scale on the bottom right, you kind of get an idea as to how big your part is. So from there, you can kind of just choose a size of the element. And this is something that you'll only find in versions 14 and up. So if you have an older version than that, you need to update to the latest one right away. So that's how this works here. Now, what I'm going to go ahead and try and do now is I'm going to try to make the best mesh that I can from this. So here we can see that I have, one element that's very skewed off there, that's not letting the whole thing flow nicely. So in this case, since I want these elements to flow this way, I can kind of already tell that I have more elements on this side than I do on this side. So I can just kind of increase the number of elements there. And you'll see that now I have a triangular element. But if I increase it one more on this side, that should go ahead and fix it a little bit. Now, in some cases, you'll find that it'll start doing some crazy stuff going on, right? So what we can do is we can use those edges that we were suppressing earlier, and we can actually grab those edges and use them to our advantage. And we can create edges in order to force the elements to do certain specific things. So for example, here, in order to keep everything very squared off here, what I can do is I can go ahead and click return. And my mesh just disappeared here, so it's probably set to this blue one here. So you can see how I didn't quite notice that this one was set as the current component. So what I ended up needing to do is I need to change this to the current component again, and then just remesh the whole thing again. So select all of the displayed surfaces, click mesh, and set this value to 2, recalculate all, and remesh. Okay, so we're back to where we started here. So now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and click return, and you should see that the part is actually purple now. So now what I was trying to get at earlier is that you can see also here we have some elements that are left over from that previous mesh, and if we wanted to delete those, we can just go to the delete panel here, this red X, and I'm just going to go ahead and select the elements here, right? And then we just go ahead and click delete, and that'll delete those elements for me. So now I can go back to where I was working. So I'll click return, and I'm back to where I left off. Now, what I was trying to get at is that we can use these green edges, so these edges that are generated, and use them to our advantage. So we don't always want to just suppress them, right? So what we can do is I can generate an edge, for example, from here to here to try to make everything square off a little bit better so that we don't have these kind of funky elements being produced. So what I can do is I can click return and get out of the auto mesh panel. I go ahead and select geometry, and then we can go back to that quick edit panel. And this, like I mentioned, this quick edit panel is very useful and it'll help you a lot. So here we have a couple of options. You can see split surface line, split node, surface with node. And what these will do is it'll split the surface, essentially creating that edge, either by using nodes. So you can go from node to node, where I can select this node to this node, and it'll generate that geometry, right, or that edge. That's one way we can do it, or I can reject that. And what I can do also is I can select a node, and select an edge, and it'll just go perpendicular to that edge. So if your elements are not lined up exactly how you would want them, you could also use that method. But that'll square off this geometry a little bit better, right? So another thing that I can do is, like, let's say I don't want this taper here and I want all of these elements to be uniform. I can go ahead and click this node. I can select this edge. And sometimes it won't do it as nicely, especially if the two edges on the side are not perfectly perpendicular. So in that case, I'm just going to go ahead and just leave that there. So what we can do is we can go ahead and remesh some of these regions here. So now that I've created that edge, I can go ahead and go back to my auto mesh panel. Now notice I'm going to be jumping back to that auto mesh panel quite a bit. So that's where we start using this shortcut, F12. So if I press F12, you'll see that it automatically sends me to this auto mesh panel, right? Now here we can go ahead and select again. We select all of the surfaces and we click mesh, and it'll remesh the whole thing. Now we want to set this value to 2 again, and we want to click mesh. Now notice how this region now is a lot nicer, right? So we have this tapered one, but everything else is a lot nicer now. So we can go ahead and do that for all of these different areas. So I can do the same from here to here, or I can do, I can even out the number of elements here. Now, if there's a certain area that you don't want to remesh, like I don't know if you guys noticed, but at that point when I selected all of these surfaces, all of the meshes changed for me, right? But let's say I just wanted to change a certain region. Then what you can do is, you don't have to select all of the surfaces. You can just select, for example, this area here. I'll set this value to 2. And if I select just one surface, then what it'll do is it'll only change the mesh for that particular surface. So if there's a certain region that you want to fix, then you can just select that one surface. Now the thing is, since I'm only editing this surface, I can't make any changes to any of the other surfaces here. So since this edge is attached, this side is attached to this mesh, and I can't make changes to it, if I click on that number and I try to move it, it won't change because I can't edit this mesh on the right side. So if I wanted to make changes to both of these sides, I would have to select, if I click return, I would have to select this surface and this surface over here on the right as well. And now if I mesh, I can make adjustments to both of these sides, but I can't make changes to this one here. So just keep that in mind, okay? So if you select something like the surface up here, and I select that top surface, you'll notice I can change this edge on the right, but I can't change this value on the top, the bottom, or the left, because those are attached to another mesh. So it won't let me do that. So keep that in mind. Whenever there's a mesh attached to it that you're not changing, it won't let you change the nodes on the edge for that particular side. So always just keep that in mind. Now, over here, let's say I wanted to clean this up. I can use another edge, just create an edge from here to here, and just have the elements flow down this way. So I can go ahead and just go hit return, and it'll send me back to the panel that I was in because I used the shortcut. And if you don't know where this panel is, again, if I click return all the way, you go to geometry, quick edit, okay? Now, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go from node to node. I'm going to select from this node to this node and generate the mesh that way. Now you can see that the elements don't quite flow as nicely here, right? So what I can do is I can go ahead and just change the value for both of these meshes. Okay? Now here we have 10 elements and we want it to flow nicely here. So we have 3 elements on top, 2 elements on the bottom. We want to increase that value by 1. It looks like here we want to decrease this value by 1 because we have 1 element up here and then we have 10, so that's 11. We want to bring that element down, and that should make it a little bit nicer. Now here we have two elements flowing in this direction, and there's one element here. So if I increase that value to 2, it'll make these elements a little bit smoother. And then here it looks like we have too few elements. So if I increase that value there as well, then we could do that. Now in this case, we have a triangular element in the middle here, so we want to kind of change that. So I would have to decrease the value on the left side here, which means that I would have to decrease the value for all of these because all of them have the same number of nodes. So if I needed to do that, what I can do is I can just click return again, and I can select all of these surfaces. Now, if I wanted to move them all together, first I would need to make sure that they have the same number of elements there. So if I click mesh, it'll keep the same number. Now, if I want to move them all together, what I can do is I can check this box here that says link opposite edges, and that'll make sure that all of the edges that are opposite to each other will move together. So if I increase one or decrease one, it'll change the value for all of them. So what I'm going to do is I want to increase this to 2 again. It looks like we just need 2 over here. And then we have, yeah, that should be perfect there. So now, in this case, you can see that the elements don't want to flow all the way through here. So then what we can do is we can change it and force it to only do quad elements on this face here. So what I can do is I can use some of the other options that I have down here on the left, and I can use these mesh style buttons. Okay, so this mesh style button, what this will do is it'll change the parameter for what type of elements I want to create. So for example, if I created only quads here and I wanted only triangles there, then I can change this to trias. I click on set surface, and now if I click on the surface here, you'll see that I can go ahead and click mesh, and it'll only create triangular elements. But in this case, I want quads only for all of these surfaces. So I want to do quads only there, and I want to do quads only over here as well. Now, in that case, it didn't change it, and the reason for that is because there's other limitations that are happening here. So I hit return, and I'm just going to go ahead and focus on this one region here. Now, what's going on is that in this case, I have actually, if you look at the number of elements that I have here, I would need 11 on this side. Oh, it looks like my software just froze. Now, let's see, I have a question here. How to decrease and increase the elements? Any hotkeys or only the mouse? For the most part, when you're working with the mouse or with the 2D meshing, you have to kind of just click on it. There's really no hotkey to change it, just because once you start working with really complicated geometry, you're not going to be able to control it as much if you start using hotkeys. And there's going to be some edges that you're going to be messing with, and some of this stuff takes a little bit of time, but in the end, it pays off because you end up having elements that are higher quality, and when you have higher quality elements, then at that point you end up having better results in the end. So it's much more important to have higher quality elements, even if it takes a little longer. So I would say really focus on making sure that you have some nice elements. Can you import meshes from other softwares like SolidWorks? Yes, you can import meshes from pretty much anything. If you wanted to import a mesh itself, then what you would need to do is you click on this import button on the top here, and just make sure you have it set to import solver deck. And what import solver deck will do is it'll bring in all of the FEA information, and you're able to bring in meshes from OptiStruct, ansys, dyna, Abaqus. What was the other one? We have pretty much anything really. Nastran, you can do Nastran. So normally, if I know SolidWorks meshes in Nastran format, so when you export from SolidWorks, it'll be a Nastran code. So you just bring in a Nastran code and import the mesh in here, and you'll be able to manipulate it in here. Now, the one thing that I want to kind of cover here next is, let's see, let me just go ahead and reopen that that file I was working with. And Hypermesh. So okay, now this was on chapter 3, and I was doing mesh edit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this again, and I'll remesh it real quick here for you guys. So I just need this to 2. I set this to displayed, and okay, here we are. So trying to kind of just wrap up this section here. For the most part, what you end up needing to do now is once you have all of these types of geometry here, one thing that is really important to do as well that not a lot of people will tell you about is when you have these circular geometries, normally you want to have what we call a washer around there. So what we mean by a washer is kind of a row of elements that follows the actual circumference of the circle here. Instead of having these elements that kind of skew off or taper off like this, in order to capture the stress around holes, which is very important, much more accurately, what we can do is we can actually generate what we call a washer. And the way you do that is we go to geometry, again, the quick edit panel, and we have this option for washer split. And when you do washer split, you want to set this value to, I don't know, let's say 1. And then you want to just kind of click on the edge that you want to work with, and you'll see that it generates this nice row of elements that's going around the actual circle. And this is very important for when you're trying to generate meshes that have holes, or you're trying to have parts that bolt up together and you're going to attach together. And I'll show you guys on tomorrow's training how to do simulate bolts and bolt connections between meshes. But then for this here, if we go ahead and try to remesh this now, what we can do is we can just set this value to the same amount. I'll just do 13 actually. And you'll see that you'll have a nice row of elements that goes around the circle here. And this will capture the stresses around, the bearing stresses around the actual holes, which helps you with your results later on. So this is a very useful way of editing your geometry. So now that's something that is very useful. It's something that will help you guys a lot. So I recommend that you guys spend the time to use these edges to your advantage and generate a nice clean mesh. Just because at one point, some of these meshes will create a nice mesh that you can use later on to generate even nicer meshes further along the line, especially if you're working with like 3D meshes or something like that.